geographer, Jenny Robinson. She teaches human geography at University College of London. Um, Jenny Robinson, I think of you, Jenny, I don't know if you think this is fair, but I think of you as someone who's quite this, if that's a geography thing or it's a you thing. But your work, I find people engaging with your work in lots and lots of different settings and lots of different contexts. And I think that has to do with the quality of your work, that you have no respect for where urban planning begins and ends, where geography begins and ends, where political theory begins and ends, where the global South begins and ends. So it's really, your work has this wonderful quality of crossing boundaries and in the process pushing us to think and unthink our assumptions. This was true of your earlier post-apartheid visioning work. This was true of I think, the work that you're going to present today, which is about the large-scale projects. And it's obviously true of this upcoming transnational work. I came across Jenny's work on a methodological, when I was doing a sort of methodological sort of thinking process with a colleague. We were doing this book that was about a traveling thing, but it was also a book about a city in Spain and a city in Brazil and Chicago. And I had been a little bit aware of the debate about post-colonial urbanism and the very important critiques that Jenny launched and has continued to develop. But what I found just really incredibly useful in your methodological writings, and this is among the many reasons we're inviting you today, was that it allowed us, and it allowed me, and it allows all of us who engage to somehow move a little bit beyond the sort of stalemate that we have in urban studies. And the stalemate refracts in many ways, but for me, it was, are you an urban sociologist or are you a Brazil expert? And somehow I did not want to give up either one of those things. I really am very committed to the context that I wrote about. I have a gazillion ties and real deep, meaningful connections to the cities in Brazil I write about, but I never imagined that would be somehow giving up a more general claim on theorizing. And your work, Jenny, has been really, really profoundly influential to me and to many others in this generative way that you want us to think about other ways of comparing, other ways of thinking about what is a productive comparison. So with all of that said, with much respect and admiration and gratitude, thank you for coming, Jenny. We're very lucky to have you today.
Thank you so much. That's really kind of you. And I think I recognize some shared problematics there, which is why it's been great to have the opportunity to chat and engage in different academic contexts. And now in the strange virtual space that makes all sorts of seminars possible, which has some great advantages for us, actually. So anyway, here I sit in my home, and it's slightly weird to present a talk from this context, but I'm very pleased to share with you the work that I've been doing with other colleagues, Phil Harrison in Johannesburg, Fulong Wu, who is based here at UCL with me, works on Shanghai's very prominent Chinese urban scholar. So we clubbed together to try out comparative urbanism across Johannesburg, London, and Shanghai. So that's going to be the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about. But I guess before I set up the PowerPoint and go through some of the details, I thought, in a way, the challenges that you outlined, Gianpaolo, are exactly the ones that bother me. Is how do we build our understandings from the different contexts that we work on, that we live in, that inspire us, at the same time as being able to participate in wider conversations about the nature of the urban, about the nature of urban politics, about the politics of development and urban financing, and so on. So trying to straddle these two things. So that very much grabs the puzzle space that I'm in. And then sort of within that, I guess for me, the project has been for some time now, in fact, a very long time, 20 years or so. I think the idea that whatever it is that urban studies might be, or the urban might be, it really needs to reconfigure itself to take account of the many different contexts of urbanism, of urbanization, of the many different voices that are speaking about and shaping the urban, and also the vast array of different kinds of processes of urbanization that we have to think about. So in a way, the intervention that I'm trying to craft around the thematic of comparative urbanism is to try and respond to these three demands on us in recrafting, rethinking urban studies. So the post-colonial, which is the one that has been with me for the longest time. I think the provocations of planetary urbanization, which have been very prominently debated recently, and which for me index the uncertain territories of the urban, the fragmentations, the huge extensions, the difficulty of naming what the urban is and knowing where it is in all its complexity and diversity. And I think that some of the debates have asked through questions of positionality. So who is speaking the urban? What voices are present? What experiences of the urban are included? And I think all of those are at stake in reconfiguring urban studies. And for me, within the positionality, you know, I can't say how it is for people based in the North American Academy, but my trajectory, which is back and forth between South Africa and the UK, I think I'm very acutely aware of the positionality within the Academy internationally of whose voices are counted, whose writing is read, whose insights and concepts are circulated. So the positionalities that also interest me are those that fragment and really fracture the collegiality of international academic discourse, speaking from China or speaking from poor African contexts. How does urban studies open up conversations across great diversity? Okay, so I'll turn on hopefully the PowerPoint and get going then. So these are the three cases that we picked up to think about. And I'll explain a little bit why we chose to look at large-scale urban developments in a bit. I'll first of all jump into the why comparative urbanism. What does it mean to rethink comparative urbanism, and what kind of directions am I going in with that? So each of these three developments was rather different. I think that's important for us. A new piece of London, which is envisaged as a housing and office space, corridors of new developments through the city of Johannesburg, which are meant to stitch together the apartheid city and bring poorer residents into the city centre, from which they've been excluded in far-flung townships for a very long time. And then finally, a very large development in southeast of Shanghai, Lingang, which is envisaged as a new industrial settlement meant to be upgrading the economic offer of Shanghai. So we were funded by the SRC, which was great, and managed to pull together a team across these three contexts. The main provocation in Johannesburg was to fill in the spaces of a bus rapid transit system that worked its way through the city from black areas to central business districts and reaching through to some of the wealthiest parts of the city. So really stitching together the diversity, running through very different parts of the city. And the idea of the planners was to try and fill in around this, to densify along this track a bus rapid transit to allow low-income housing to be developed. The London provocation, currently industrial area, a lot of railway land, sort of feels a bit like a harbor area to me when I go there. Here, the idea is to bring a lot of dense residential development, very high rise office blocks and so on. And the reason for that is, again, a transport intervention from the central government to build a high-speed train from London to the north, going through this bit of London, and really pretty much a kind of outer London, very poor part of London, going to be transformed. And here you see the strange setting of this deep water port in Shanghai on the right-hand side, and in the little hills in the distance is basically a very tiny island. And a 32-kilometer road bridge was built from the mainland out to this island. And then this deep water port, which much of it is going to be fully automated, has been developed across some islands. So when we thought about why would we be able to compare these three things, the thing we thought of was, I mean, partly because we were interested in the provocation of comparing quite different contexts, and how can we start to think across different contexts, because a lot of the time urban studies literature, comparative literature, steers one towards comparing quite similar things. But obviously, if urban studies is going to post-colonialize and transform itself, we have to start to talk to each other across quite different contexts. So what was the basis for thinking about these? And we thought of this as the shared features of large-scale developments. And I'll come back a little bit more to why that matters in framing comparison. So they all they have some very similarities. They rely on transport infrastructure. That's a bit coincidental, they needn't have. But the important things for us, which is common to all large-scale developments in cities, most of them probably, that they have to navigate complex jurisdictional issues across many different agencies, different elements of the state. They have to usually, because they're so big, they involve themselves in engagements with communities who are often resisting, being displaced, and so on. And they have to try and secure financing. This is not easy for huge developments to mobilize. In the case of the London case, £2.5 billion. In the case of the Lingang case, it was that much per annum. So these are very large developments. And the final thing, which is not here, which is a long time period. So these kinds of developments, they often take 30, 40 years. They change, they have to be reinvented quite often, they stall, sometimes they never come about. So we thought this was a good basis, that all of them were based on in that sort of way. And as it turned out, there's a much more robust, even stronger urban reason for comparing them, which is that they all, and this is really very common again in the urban developments, they all rely on the development itself, the making of a new part of the city, to realize the value stream to pay for it. And I think this is not uncommon in the long history of urbanization, that we can urbanize, we can develop places, because in the development, they realize value, which can enable us to make the development come about. So this was a common feature as well, which we might have thought of in advance. So why reinvent comparison? If you haven't already, you can find some links on my website to some reading in which I outline some of the reasons why the traditional inherited comparative methods are really problematic. The first reason would be that very often we were instructed not to compare very different things. So kind of controlling for similar features of national context. So if your city you're thinking about, or the project you're interested in, is in a poor country or a rich country, then, oh, we can't compare them. Or all sorts of assumptions about the incomparability of different cities have been at work. And I think one key important point, which links to the planetary urbanization idea, is this kind of methodological cityism. So in fact, it's very wrong of me to say we're comparing Shanghai, London, and Joburg. We're comparing three very specific large-scale projects. And in a sense, the interesting thing about the comparative practice that I'm outlining today is that I think it gives us a basis for thinking about urbanization, even though it's not necessarily happening in cities, even though it's fragmented and far-flung, might be a new satellite city in the middle of a remote kind of area, might be something that doesn't necessarily look and feel like a part of cities or the urban. But we can start to think about urbanization on the base, in a comparative way, because we come to think about the territories and territorializations that create new kinds of urban spaces. So I think that might be, a wider methodological provocation. Now, the main thing here is about the variety point, which is very often, if you look at somebody doing a very neat and proper old-fashioned comparison, they try and isolate the variables that are at work. So to try and get places that are very similar sizes or experiencing very similar historical contexts, and then to really narrow down, you want to look at a very specific thing. And I cite quite often a great study by Susan Clark, which looked at 8 American cities, which try to place them, they're similar sizes, pairs of them are in the same states in the US. They've experienced the same kind of fiscal crisis. So this is a kind of moment when what we would call today a neoliberalization is going on. And then, having done all that, what she looks at is the variation in something else altogether. That is, she looks at the variation in institution formation, in the conflicts between government and residents, community, state interactions, and so on. The nature of these, then, is what interests her. So she and other comparativists, so very famous in this line is Hank Savage and Cantor. And so they really, when it comes down to it, they're thinking with the variety that they encounter. So my provocation is, well, let's just think with that variety. Let's really interrogate that variety, because that's what we need to understand, the variety of urbanization. And on what basis might we compose a reasonable grounds for bringing a variety of experiences together. And here, for us, the large-scale urban development, and in a corollary, the kind of territorialization of urban outcomes, trans-scalar territorialization, becomes a foundation for reasonably looking at the variety of urban outcomes, a variety of kinds of state action, a variety of kinds of financing, and so on. So I've tried to really loosen what comparison is. And I think alongside others, Colin McFarlane talking about the comparative imagination, and other people have been inspired by the idea of comparison, Jamie Peck, Helga Leitner, and so on. So comparisons, then, the broad practice, I want to cast it very wide, of thinking the urban through elsewhere, being inspired by another case, drawing on concepts that have come from somewhere else, thinking through connections to other places, so we can better understand outcomes. And for me, very importantly, is to stretch our conceptualizations and to open up conversations about the urban. So I'm in the middle of finalizing a text which sort of draws out all these, the points I'm about to make in more detail. You can find this particular slide, which talks about one kind of comparative tactic, which is to trace the connections between cities. So you'll find from my website a link to a paper online which looks at that, thinking comparison through connections. So the cities are shaped by many different kinds of connections, a multiplicity, a proliferation of interconnections and flows among cities. And these, in a sense, they invite us to explore repeated instances, things that occur again and again, or transfer through policy circulations, or which are associated with circuits of investment or material flows of people. So thinking through these interconnections gives us a basis for understanding the urban as a multiplicity of interconnected and repeated outcomes, which are different every time, would be the Deleuzian wager. So to think about that. And what can we do with that? I try and outline some ways in which practically the tactics we adopt rather than the grounds of comparison. So here the grounds of comparison are the interconnections, what I'm calling genetic comparative strategies. They're about the genesis, the very specific flows causing urban outcomes. So here we can follow the circuits to identify how urbanization is going on. We can identify the instances and think about many different instances. We can add them together to tell a rich story about this aspect of the urban. Each one would tell a different story. So the analysis we start off with could be subtracted from. And in a sense, each one might ask us to look at the next case differently. So we thicken our understanding. Every case matters. Now, the other approach is more about the researcher-defined comparative method, which I call generative. So here, what I'm suggesting in loosening the traditional practices is that what do we need to start a reasonable comparison? As I'm suggesting here, starting with the shared features of large-scale developments, the fact that the three that we look at all inhabit this world of longue durée, of complex institutional negotiations, of complex funding strategies. So these shared features then allow us to look up at the variety of processes and agents and interests shaping urbanization and start to think with that variety. So the conceptual starting points might then be some shared feature we've identified, or actually we can start to think with the concepts that we might have to mind. So, you know, gentrification likes to whiz about the world, naming everything. Well, let's interrogate that. You know, let's take a look at a case and question that concept. And then I also suggest that here in our generative comparative methods, we might be inspired by the urban world. It presses on us, it asks us questions, it poses problems. So thinking through the territories of the urban, thinking with specificity. The urban is primarily a form of specificity. If you are a Lefebvrean of any kind, then this is the nature of the urban. It's the full concrete totality of space, the specificity of the particular urban outcome is what we could start to think with. So, and the thing I would say is that these shift around in my experience and my students' experience of trying to work comparatively is what are the ground, what is the comparator, what are the terms of engaging across the different contexts? These shift over time. And this is a great collection from Michael Guggenheim and colleagues where he talks about assembling a comparator in a kind of STS way, that slowly it comes together, a muddle of the people, the data, the context, the problems, and somehow a comparator emerges. And for us, this happens. So we started off with the, you know, the shared features that I described to you of large-scale developments, but we ended up someplace else, which is really inspired by ideas of territorialization and the transcalar nature of urbanization and especially large-scale developments. So one sort of moment in our thinking was very helpfully pushed along by this great book from Gavin Shatkin, where he thinks about three different large-scale developments: China, India, and Indonesia, I think. Sorry if that's incorrect. And he thinks about the rent gap. So each place had a rent gap, which could be opened up for exploitation, which could be produced through state action and then appropriated by somebody or other in the context of these very large-scale transnational developments, which are shaping urbanization in so many places. And what he develops from that is, one, he suggests that to understand urban politics and to theorize urban politics, we have to have a state-centered theorization if it's going to make any sense for Asia. So whereas we've been focusing a lot on financialization, on urban policy circulations and so on, actually theorizing the interests of the state as such was very, very important in an Asian context. And so for us, that made us look more closely at the Chinese case and what we learn from the case of Shanghai. But it also exposes a variety of different kinds of political strategies, different kinds of interests. Now, he kind of resolves this in some way through the book and the concept of neoliberalism, which we would probably want to open ourselves to a wider diversity of concepts. Now, I think for those of you who are doing the course reading that I suggested you look at, Albert and Rouenet, came up with this interesting idea. So you raise a lot of questions in the Google Docs, which is really interesting about the politics of that. And it'd be great if we can talk about that later. But the thing that I took from this and from Ludwig's wider work on financialization is he's not focusing on the, you know, the circuits or the globalized processes, this thing called financialization, or the mirror would be neoliberalization. But he's trying to think from the territory about the multiplicity of different kinds of transcalar and transnational processes that are shaping the territorial outcome that he's interested in, operating together in that space and constituting interests, actions, outcomes. And then we can link that also to some ways of thinking about specificity. And there's an interesting essay from Christian Schmid here. And he brings it down at one moment to the rapport territorial. So the sort of set of regulatory arrangements which sort of consolidate around a territory over a long period of time, which would have their origins in many different contexts and have some great and deep regulatory specificity quite often, and hinting at some kind of informality to how these things are navigated. So for us, that was quite important. And what it came down to for us, so here I just tried to visually identify that we're talking about three quite different kinds of things. So when Susan Feinstein was writing in the late 2000s about large-scale developments, you know, New York, London, Amsterdam, her suggestion was that we're seeing a lot of convergence in the form of these developments, in the way in which they governed, in their neoliberalization. And I think the big study by Frank Mullert and Swingado and others, also in the late 2000s, was sort of thinking within the context of shared frameworks and circulating regulatory and governance practices. And we're really struck by how different these cases are and how much we can learn from that difference. So here, not only the three quite different goals, industrialization, low income housing, and who knows what in London is like overblown, over expensive, very dense kinds of developments. But it asks us to disconnect these outcomes from any pre-given set of processes. So we have to look at the territorialization, the specific outcomes and specific bundle of things that are shaping that outcome on their own terms. So that was quite interesting for us. And I think I was intrigued to go back and find out where variegation came from. And if anyone wants to read this essay, it's a great essay from Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore, who then used this term since then. But 2007, they seem to have coined this to try and address the problems of the space-blind varieties of capitalism analysis, and really wanting to think about both connections and territorial outcomes. But I think the problem here is that it gets snapped onto a certain set of wider processes. So we already kind of know the answer when we go and look at so many cases. Oh, it's neoliberalization, it's financialization, and we're just looking at some variegation, some variety there. So what I'm suggesting is we really want to reconfigure our conceptualization. We have to rather start with the specificity, with these transscalar territorializations, and think from that. So just a little bit of content about the three cases. I won't go on for too long about that because we have you know, everyone falls asleep watching Zoom, I think, or gets a headache, or has their breakfast. Interesting. So here's a map of the territory of Lingang, this new satellite city, one of 9 imagined in Shanghai from about 2005. And one of the things that is clearly evident in the changing nature of the administrative division of the territory is the need to assemble and be flexible about how different bits of the state come together to make the development happen. So not only was there need to create a new kind of administrative scale to the state in order to oversee the administration of this bit of the municipality of Shanghai. So it's very much a municipal project, but they had to mobilize all the different district committees, the different state-owned enterprises who were drawn in, and very importantly, the local township committees, the very local level of government, have been allocated small bits of land to develop for industrial activities in order to gain the benefit, to keep the money, to pay for the social consequences, resettlement, and social needs of the community that are there. So it's a very long and interesting story, which you can read in this great paper from Ji Shen and Fulong Wu and their collaborator, who I don't know that person, sorry. So these different kinds of territories was kind of carved up, and at different times, different elements of the state were brought in. Now, the territory is also very important because it is the basis for financing. So some borrowing of income against the land, which is really just fictive land in a way owned by the municipality, and against the future income streams that the municipality expected. Now, this is one important aspect of our analysis, which is that how the financing of the development works, which is really embedded in the the specificity of the regulatory context makes a big difference to the outcomes, a big difference to what's possible. So here is just another illustration of this transscalar reorganization, complex intragovernmental territorialization around the project of the Lingang satellite city. And here is a good slogan when things were faltering. Problem is quite a long way from the center of Shanghai. It's not great for people to buy houses, so they couldn't use the usual residential land business to get money. They're relying on taxes of industry and some sales of industrial land. So at some stage, they bought these 4 powerful state-owned enterprises which had developed Pudong Island, which you will all know about, who had great reserves, and encouraged them to come forward to Lingang to try and make things happen. So all these different motivations. And I think in terms of the finances, what's really important is that these different agencies are tasked with a political goal, which is to make a success of the development, not to make a huge profit, just not to make a loss. So this is is a very interesting business model. So this is the kind of comparative outcome that we got, was 3 business models. How was this business model put together with these certain kinds of financial resources, certain kinds of territorial arrangements, certain kinds of organizational restructuring? Now, the London case is rather different, and for probably about 20 plus years, London's development has been focused on these opportunity areas, which are very controversial in residents' organizations. These are little fragments of the city, which you can see on the right-hand side. In the case of our case study, was called Old Oak Park Royal. These are presented as little jigsaw puzzle pieces. And the Old Oak Park Royal one is quite big. For anyone who knows London, it's as big as the kind of West End or a large part of the Docklands development. And it's one of these little triangles. I think I'm trying to identify which one it might be. Probably number 18 or so. So in there, the idea is these are often deindustrialized areas. So you'll recognize this from New York, places that are, in ruins, or they're very important parts of the functioning of the city, like where the railways get fixed and where the trains turn around. You can't really function without that stuff in the city. But here, because this train line is coming, the idea is that this now, the land value proposition is vastly increased, the connectivity is vastly increased, and here's an opportunity which then gets demarcated. And the crucial thing about London's development is that each little bit of the area that gets demarcated in this way for development has to pay for itself, has to pay for own infrastructure development. So whatever gets built here, out of the building, literally out of the height of the construction, has to be squeezed the income to pay for the roads, the increased transport, the remediation of the land, the social infrastructure, and so on. So masses, and all the affordable housing. So this is the main point of the London one. So this is the kind of landscape that is there, some sleepy old industrial buildings and a canal, which is lovely to cycle along, some new and old recent developments, some Victorian cottages, and these large railway lands. Now, the infrastructure costs are, as these things are, a very variable thing, but say initially they're thinking about £1.5 billion for the different elements. And it all has to come out of what I think you would recognize in New York as well as a kind of planning game. So a negotiation between the developer and the planners to decide how much of the profit from the development should come to the mitigation of the development, the provision of the needs of residents. So here, the calculation is very much, if you have more affordable housing, you get less income from the development. So the pressure is to make high-end expensive development and not very affordable housing. And basically, with no interest of the central government in funding this, the development really has to pay for itself. And if you just look at the bottom quote there, this is from there was a change in mayor. So we had Boris Johnson, a kind of not quite Trump equivalent, he now runs our whole country. So Boris was the mayor for a while. And then when the new mayor came in, he interrogated this development, the Old Oak Park Royal development. And he felt that given the demands, the need for the infrastructure bill, the high cost of the infrastructure is going to directly impact on the nature of the development, the height, the quality, the services provided, and so on. And so it has. In our research here, I was the kind of London person, has been very embedded in the local community groups, and they've really been pushing against this, you know, really unacceptable kind of development. These are all the kind of CGI images, some building already happening. And you get a sense that this is a vastly different kind of urban environment than that people live in, and that, you know, all their little houses, actually quite dense developments anyway, are going to be really overshadowed by these relatively high-end, very reduced public space kind of buildings. And for me, the iconic thing is that in nearly every one of the planning applications that's come forward, the children's play space is on the roof. So this goes against the mayor's own policy. It's to try and build out across the whole footprint of the development. So just quickly to turn to the Joburg case. So here's the sort of mapping of 3 corridors running through the city, and the land development which might go alongside the BRT. And for me, a really interesting thing that the local planners did, which I think is iconic of their role, is that they brought in consultants to try and devise ways to create an affordable and viable densification of the area alongside the corridor, to show developers that this could happen. So basically, they had to entice developers into try and make a go of dense, low-income development in this environment, which goes through many parts of the city, from sprawling townships to informal settlements to some of the most wealthy parts of the city. So how can some sort of densification offer be brought in there? And not only did they have to try and involve the developers, but in this relatively modestly resourced local authority, some sort of cobbling together of finances had to be done. So the city really drew it on its own resources and tried to really package those to put all their efforts into providing the infrastructure needed for the development, put a lot of effort into community consultation, because from the middle class people, the idea of having high-rise, low-income housing next to their small suburban houses was not very acceptable. And trying to piece together a coalition across the regional government, which was pushing for remote, large-scale human settlements to be developed, and the central government was helping with the BRT system. So they were able to plan for their future resources coming from the investment, because they have what is a very canny blended property tax, where any development, any improvement in the city property and activities will translate into an enhanced municipal resource base. So you know that if you're going to put infrastructure in and make better properties, you would get more money back. So that's a very interesting model of development. Plus, they were able to access a soft loan from the French Development Association to because this is supposed to help with climate change, that people are living in the center of the city and traveling on public transport instead of lots of minibuses. So these are some of the outcomes. It's not been the most successful of bus rapid transit systems in terms of ridership. One of the things it does is really cut through the city. So here you can see down the middle of the road on the top right-hand side, the BRT system goes, and in fact, 2 bits of the city which had been previously quite interconnected, people running across the road easily, not so great. So this hasn't been so good for business areas. But what is interesting is that a genre of low-income development, private-led, has come about in Johannesburg, which is very indigenous in the sense that it's come from a model of the inner city where there was a lot of ruined buildings which were hijacked and landlords were lost, and this is very difficult situation. So a lot of these buildings have been brought back into accessible and well-managed housing, very tightly managed, but it doesn't reach down into the poorest people in the city. So it certainly reaches into what is South Africa is a kind of gap between those who can afford a mortgage or more high level rents and those who get a government house if you're in a very poor income category. So I think what we learned from this case was the interesting nature of the municipal-wide income streams, which could be put together to fund a strategic investment in the developmental interests of poorer residents. So in London, we're looking at a tiny little fragment of the city having to pay for itself. Here, it's scooped up across the whole city and can be seen in a long-term strategic and citywide way. And then we are also very inspired, which I won't talk about now, by the way in which in Johannesburg, the electoral demands and the community mobilization played a very big part in the governance of this project. They had to be embedded in local communities. So if I just jump out with a couple of, with one table I decided to stick with because of time. So here, just to give you a sense how thinking across the three models helps us to see what a difference the specificity of the project, the way in which it's been assembled, the particular financial arrangements that are in place make quite a difference to what can be achieved. So in Old Oak in London, really a very big press to make this very profitable. So the state interests, which we learned to focus on from a Lingang case, are pushing at maximum value extraction. Highest buildings, most profit, so they can pay for the things they have to pay for as a government to provide some kind of social services, some kind of affordable housing and so on. So there's a big constraint there given the regulatory and financial arrangement. In Lingang, they could focus on long-term strategic upgrading because of the way in which they delivered the finances through tax revenues of enterprises, and that they could take a long and patient view on the returns. Their motivations were about developmental upgrade and political success for the different enterprises. And then in the Johannesburg case, we're looking at almost the opposite to London, where you really need to keep the land values low so that private sector developers can develop a very bespoke model for very low income housing, and having this geographically broad-ranging financial system. So the outcomes then are very different. And I think what makes what is for me very interesting about this is that the developmental push, something like the SDGs being rolled out, across Africa and so on. There's a lot of talk about urbanization through land value capture. So which model of capturing the value of urbanization is a good one for poor countries? So if you're taking the London model and you're trying to extract maximum value and the profit seeking and the rent seeking that would be involved in all sorts of diverse governance situations, there's something to be reflected on about how it is that urbanization is governed for developmental benefit. How can it be governed? And unfortunately, I think a lot of the discourse goes in the direction of the maximum land value capture of the London case. So these are the kinds of things that we were drawn to think about, the way in which a specific territory is being composed across these very, very bespoke arrangements for the development of that project. And then this is, I guess, as I was rereading the papers that we've been writing about this, which I'm happy to share, they should very soon be in journal space. This was, I guess, the summary that I thought I would share with you at the end. So that given the diversity of urban experiences, as we see in these three cases, it's essential that comparisons do not begin with a normalized interpretation of case studies in which the relevant processes are already identified in theory, often accompanied with a predetermined political judgment. It's essential, we think, to think anew across the diversity of context, potentially expanding the conceptual horizons for understanding the politics of urban development. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really happy to fill in details or respond to your questions and criticisms. Very happy to hear those. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. That was just really wonderful. You can see the appreciations going around the room. So we now have some time. We have approximately 25 minutes to do Q&A before we break off into just the seminar. And I would welcome everyone to ask a question. If you could use the raise hand function in your Zoom, that'll make it easier for us to keep track. And Raquel can unmute you. So we look forward to your questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing talk. I was really struck by your methodological approach to comparative urbanisms, and specifically because of my own research where I'm doing comparative work within a region, but each city that I'm kind of dealing with, and I also liked how you wanted to think about cities as territories. But if you could just say some more about what you've termed the comparative tactics for more global urban studies, just a little bit more on that. I would appreciate just hearing how you came to that approach and kind of just unpacking that a little more, please.
Jenny, you're
I'm delighted to share with you some work on that if you're interested in a little while. So I guess the perhaps I come up with my screen again would be helpful. So basically, what I've tried to work with is these two basically grounds for comparing. So instead of grounds being that you have, I just got to zip through the old-fashioned way, can't work out how to escape from this. So what good reasons would we have for comparing different cities, different urban outcomes, different phenomena, different urbanization processes? And I was trying to think with the spatiality of the urban, and basically this idea that the urban is differentiated through these interconnections which arrive differently in different contexts. So that's a kind of formulation. It's also diverse. So when we as a researcher look around, and this is also Deleuzian, he's interested in how it is that as we come to know something, we use many different concepts. We have available any concept we can find to think with. So why not? So we're agentful researchers. And I think this has been a feature of social science research. I was just recently rereading some new translations of Max Weber, and he's, his ideal types, which have been so badly treated, I think, over the years, offer this opportunity for a researcher-driven question. I mean, it has many pitfalls. That is, we think from our own place, we think in certain ways about different places, we have our own questions, which are often, might be problematic in how they frame things. But this kind of generative, concept-driven process. And then I try and look at some tactics. So the tactics of the differentiated connection approach, genetic approach, I've written those up quite clearly. And the ones for generative approach, I mean, it could be very diverse. On what basis do we think is a reasonable starting point to think across different contexts? And sometimes they might be post hoc, So Gianpaolo, you had the paper that I read of yours recently, where you bump into somebody at a conference and you realize, oh, you were talking about something very similar. Let's think these things together. So how does this come about? It's very complicated, I'm sure. So what I've done, and I'm finalizing really a manuscript of a book called Comparative Urbanism, Tactics for Global Urban Studies. And I tried to just pull out some ways in which people work. So ours shared features, I described the mobile concepts. The Urban Territories, a really good paper, is one by Colin McFarlane, and I'm sorry, his name is escaping me, his colleague who I know very well, but I can't remember his surname. And they've written about creating comparisons which stay really, really close to the specificity of the example. So not layering up concepts which might travel and whiz about the world. Things that are very close and specific. So very kind of SDS, actinetwork theory, materialities, assemblages approach. And then thinking from singularities and specificity. So from the context where we're embedded, and we really are committed to thinking with that context, that's the ideas that we worry about, the politics we care about. But might our ideas have some purchase for other people? Might they be launched into the world and travel? So I think these are repertoires. Invent your own, but that's just trying to think, if we're not going to operate in some sort of formulaic, rule-driven, old-fashioned methodology, how might we start with the particularities of the city, the form of the urban, and thinking with the specificity as the necessary form of the urban is, I think, something to explore some more.
Who else would like to ask Jenny a question?
Well, I just have a question about, okay. So I have a question about the term specificity. So when you talk about specificity, are you also including like terms of like inclusion, including these diverse populations that that you have these projects in? So are the interests of the specificities, do you mean like we're being very inclusive, we're being interests of these diverse populations?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And again, this is something that I think a number of you were discussing in the Google Docs. You know, so what is the politics of all this? What is the exclusions and inequality? How do we understand that? And I think that's a very robust question. So I think, but again, I'm not sure the answer is sometimes what we might start with, you know, so I'm not sure the answer is financialization or neoliberalization. So take financialization. One of the ways in which the financialization of housing in London is working, I don't think we have much of this predatory vulture capitalism at work here, but we have large pension funds that want to come in and build housing for long-term reliable returns. And this resonates very well with the mayor's ambition to build housing that's well managed, that's reasonably affordable for middle-class people, in which people have a security of tenure, and so on. And in fact, it's not clear that financialization works in a way that advances inequality here. And in the Johannesburg case, we had a very interesting set of developers who were trying to assemble their, you know, Joburg model of low-income housing, which had come up in the inner city with a range of social housing providers and other private developers, and securitize it. So they're trying to assemble a sufficient mass of housing, very low income, for financialization by pension funds. And there had been Canadian pension funds interested in low-income housing securitization in Joburg already. So what could financialization do? You know, pension fund interests. So in Tanzania, for example, pension funds, the national pension funds are eager to invest in housing as a way of securing their returns. So it's, you know, I guess, yeah, the politics, my point would be that the politics of the situation needs to be determined out of the assembling of different actors, their interests, their configurations, the pathways, the context, the histories, and the political relations, you know, so.
Thank you.
We have Malcolm and then Riley.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I joined a little bit late, so I'm sorry if this is something that was already talked about. So I'm really sympathetic to your argument about breaking out of this kind of methodological cityism where we try to compare across cases, and we should, you know, get free of this kind of bounded unit that we're talking about the city when we compare. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how then you go about reconstructing a unit of analysis to compare. And I think you've talked a little bit already about these little kind of guides that you use to find that, you know, do we compare processes, particularities, shared features, and so on. But maybe more concretely, can you talk about, in the case that you presented today, how did you land on what to compare, or like what to focus on that was the interesting like little unit to compare? In my research, I study kind of conflicts over large scale climate change infrastructure in cities. And every time I look at a different project, I find there's a different type of controversy. And so I say what I study are controversies over visions of the future in this regard. But I wonder how, like, if you have any kind of advice or thoughts on how to land on something more specific.
Okay, sorry, I didn't unmute. So this was, yes, I'm sorry, this was right in the beginning, so that's a bit tricky. So I did, but it's I think your question is really a good one in terms of how your object of comparison, the reasons for comparison seem to have shifted, you know. So in a way, you start off with what seems intuitive, and I think for us this was too intuitive. In our three very different contexts, we found something that seemed to be conceptually and practically closely related and worth thinking through. So large-scale developments all facing these governance challenges, large-scale, multi-jurisdictional, long time period. And this was actually true. So when we wrote a very long paper, which is soon should be out in progress and planning, and which details the cases a lot. And these features, which we had started with, actually, they were very much present. So we confirmed that this was a good basis for bringing these three cases together, not cities, but large-scale developments. So what could be your case? Might be a project, might be train lines, might be pavements, market stalls, what aspects of the urbanization, could be the circulation of different kinds of policies. So think about Peck and Theodore's comparing child grants and participatory budgeting as different kinds of circuits. But then as I try to show, in a way, the grounds for thinking comparatively really evolved into something else. So as yours seems to have evolved into controversies, think about the different ways in which controversies over these elements of urbanization emerge. Ours evolved into think about these business models and the transcalar territorialization of urbanization processes, then which is for me very interesting, because then those transcalar territorializations really speak to the possibility of thinking urban politics in a world of planetary urbanization, where we have fragmented, dispersed, emergent urbanization forms, possibly, in many different possible kinds of locations. So yeah, so I like your question, really speaks to that, which for me is a practice. Comparativism is a practice. And I strongly recommend that essay and a book from Guggenheim, DeVille and others it's in Mattering Press, about comparative practice.
Thank you.
Riley, we had you in the queue next in the stack.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming and talking today, despite the format and the different version of how these things are going.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I definitely liked that discussion, and I think it's a really sort of challenging topic. And I'm quite interested in how you can maybe just sort of think about the ideas you're looking at as case studies and how they might scale down, because you're pulling out these shared features and these patterns of what I would consider mega development. And my work is quite particularly focused on small and mid-sized cities in America. So a population of throwing out, 150,000. And the types of development that happens there are still going to be public-private partnerships. There are still going to be a lot of the same features you're pulling out, and I'm quite intrigued how you think about the effect that scale has on the way that you can kind of leverage this generative approach. Yeah,
that's a good question. It'll be interesting how you proceed with that, because I don't really know, So I think, what does it mean to have very small settlements and very large ones like this, and the kinds of governmental capacity? I mean, Shanghai and Johannesburg, the budget of Lingang development was probably more than the whole budget of Johannesburg municipality in any given year. So But we thought about that a little bit. I mean, the one thing about those three cases, you think they might be very different size developments. And in fact, if you look at them as kind of urban regions, London and Shanghai are very similar sizes in population terms. If you take the Greater Southeast region, which is the relevant container of urbanization here, which is about 22.5, 23 million people. Same for Shanghai. And then Joburg, in fact, never gets reported as a city region, but it is an entirely contiguous city region of 15+ million people. And it's hard to know how many people are exactly in the region, with many different differentiated kinds of settlements. So I guess the one question would be to say, what is the territorialization of the urbanization processes that you're looking at? You know, are these, you know, they might well be discrete little settlements, but they might be part of bigger configurations, bigger system, economic and functional urban systems, and so on. But otherwise, looking at the distinctive qualities of different kinds of sized and different kinds of political spaces of cities is a very interesting question. And I would refer you to a book I was reading again recently, which is Patrick Le Gallet's The European Cities. And he specifically develops a theorization of an urban politics, which is about a collective, you know, the emergence, so it's also a kind of Weberian idea, the emergence of an urban scale political community in which the priorities and ambitions and kinds of developments that come out are rather different. So in that he places in a very specific historical and regional context. So, you know, I think the answer is unclear, and it would be great to see how your work goes forward.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else want to throw up a question? Well, Jenny, let me ask you a question, since we've been talking about methods and methodology, and it's a kind of big picture question, which is, I wonder if you might reflect for us on the travails of this debate around method that you've been involved in from post-colonial critique onwards. And I don't mean to put this in a provocative way, but maybe you can, why the resistance to what you presented today is so intuitive and so useful. Why do the stakes, at least from the outside, seem so high in these methodological discussions? Has it always been that way? And I wonder if we might take a bit of a longer look at that.
Yeah, it's a good question, but a little minefield, huh? So I guess, you know, on the one hand, there's the kind of politics of academic ideas, which is fair enough. So I think, and I grew up in the horizon of Marxism in South Africa in the 1980s, which was so important for our anti-apartheid politics, for anti-capitalist politics, anti-racist politics, just crucial. So to not be a Marxist was to be really wicked. So I think there's, you know, I think this retains something of a presence. That is, what does it mean to let go of an overarching analysis of capitalist urbanization processes, which are obviously very important. You can't say we don't live in the horizon of capitalism, you know, or that financialization is not going on. I mean, in all our case studies, financialization was there. So the extraction of value through, you know, the translation of our built environment into financial value capture, absolutely going on, you know. But the other side of it is that actually this is happening in very different ways with very different calculations and interests and outcomes in the different contexts. And anyway, very often financialization is so loosely defined. You know, getting a mortgage is financialization. Cities have always been built on financialization because you don't get an immediate return. To borrow some money to build something. So Yeah, so I think there's a kind of investment which is quite politicized in certain ideas. And I think, how do we navigate that? For me, it's always been a case of thinking about the politics, which is not always attached to those processes and conceptualizations. So the power of the state, the interests of residents and community mobilizations, questions of cultural politics and diversity. So, you know, I think that horizon of post-Marxism instigates a different sort of calculation. So I think there's something, you know, I just really don't know how to approach that. And I think somehow there needs to be a generosity of spirit about the fact that there are many different political agendas which intellectual work prosecutes. You know, on the other side of it, I guess, is just this ongoing tension between wider processes, circulations, networks, shared historical context, shared historical phenomena, and difference, diversity. How do we think about that differentiation, specificity? It's a huge philosophical minefield. So, you know, I think it's great if we puzzle about that and have different repertoires and ways to think about it. That my approach is not to preempt the assessment of an urban problematic through a prior philosophical, political judgment, but everyone would have their own way to come at that.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question before we end the public portion of our program. Oh, Riley, are you up again? No. Well, there is no rule we have to go until 1:15 to end the public portion. So
I have a
we
quick
would have to
question.
go at 1:12, and then the fellows and Jenny will stay on.
There was one question peeping in the background there. I don't know who that's from.
Oh, I didn't see it.
That was me again.
Oh, sorry, Yasmin. So sorry.
Okay. I just have a question. I wanted to piggyback off of my last one. And you were talking about these large scale projects, and you compared these 3 cities that, for whatever reason, are kind of in our imagination as having different histories that inform, right? Like London has a specific political history, Johannesburg has a very specific political history, and Shanghai has one as well. So I wonder then how these projects take up questions of displacement, right? And specifically who's being displaced by these new constructions, or how comparatively, as I term it, or as we might know it, as like questions of gentrification, which was termed by sociologists coming out of London, right? Like, so how all of these kinds of questions of displacement and gentrification might get addressed separately, but still in a kind of comparative manner.
Yeah, that's a really nice question for me to end on, because I think this was one of the moments of our project which was quite unexpected. So we started off with the London and Johannesburg cases with very close partnerships with community-based organizations. So I worked really closely with this citywide group called Just Space, and a network which the London Tenants Federation set up in the Old Oak area. And basically our analysis and our insights came from this enormous weight of community-based work. So many meetings, many consultations, you know, And it's part of the reason why we finished, you know, 2 years ago, the project, and I'm only just now getting the publications out, because I spent the whole of last year doing planning consultations. So we had very close relationships with community groups, also with Plan Act, which is a long-standing urban activist and advocacy group in Johannesburg, which was very important in the late anti-apartheid movement. So, and then we thought, oh, China, you know, this is like a 2-legged stool, this one. And but actually it was really interesting, because the researcher who worked on China, Zheng Wang, has published some work on this recently, I think in Urban Geography. And the finding, you know, that I mentioned briefly, that people were wanting to be displaced. They needed to leave the settlements they were in because they'd been abandoned. The social infrastructure was gone, the demands for shops was not there. People wanted to give up farming, it was tough for them, older people and so on. Others wanted to continue, so obviously it's a diverse picture. But we were really interested then in the Chinese approach, which is to give people quite a lot of compensation 2 flats, large pension, you know, and so on. So when we had a visit from our Chinese collaborators, especially Professor Yumin Ning, who came from Shanghai East China Normal University, standing on the street corner in Old Oak, looking at this new development, seeing all the plans, thinking, well, what compensation are the residents going to get? And the answer is none, absolutely none. Almost no benefits, real disbenefit, 10 years of real interruption, 2 great big trucks every minute going by with large lorry loads of rubbish and overshadowed by buildings, no social facilities. How is that possible? So actually, it was a very interesting conversation about that dimension. And then also to think about not just the buy-off, but the Chinese state's reliance on some kind of 2 writers who I quite enjoyed their paper called Bargained Authoritarianism, I think Li and Zhang, you know, that building some kind of, not necessarily consent, but some kind of stake in the development was crucial to not destabilizing the state. And then the Joburg case, where the deep embeddedness of government in community consent and voting is crucial. So I think this gave us a lot of pause for thought in the London case. And basically we have been working to argue against a kind of post-politics in London. So we don't see the erasure of a political terrain here, but we've been able to open ourselves up to the different settings of different kinds of politics. So this was a very rich conversation across those different cases. Yeah, so displacement kind of worked in different ways. Of course, gentrification is there and so on. And this was driving a lot of community activism here as well. So yeah, that's I think that's another stream of the comparison that came out, which for us was a really important set of questions. So thank you.